welcome to episode 4 of my POA podcast, Black Hand and Beyond. I'm Kent Rourke. This is episode 4, and tonight we're going to talk about Corette Scottish Chieftain. I want to thank our sponsors tonight. We're live here at Studio J at Jackson's Auto Family in Enid, Oklahoma, Chrysler Dodge Jeep Ram. We have a very cool sponsor tonight from Minnesota, Berry Sweet Acres. That's Tim and Melissa Andring from Dover, Minnesota. And we'll be talking about their story a little bit tonight in the middle of talking about Corette Scottish Chieftain. So I don't have any guests tonight, but I'm going to just bear with me. I'm going to do the talking. We have about 80-some pictures to get through tonight. And we're going to be old history because Corette Scottish Chieftain was number 18. The 18th registered POA ever. So we talked about Black Hand number 1 the first week, Corette Scottish Chieftain. Last week we went off course a little bit and talked about some prefixes, and JN and the JNJ had a couple great guests. I want to thank those guys again. We do have some sponsorships available. I do 2 Supreme Championship sponsors every week. That's a larger sponsor. It's very inexpensive though. And then I do a really cheap, just a name drop, couple name drops, no photos. Haven't had anyone take me up on that yet, but that's fine. So, and we're focusing on POA history, on Black Hand and Beyond, but we also talk about modern day stuff and on some episodes. And if you want to be a guest on the show, please give me a call, text, email, whatever. Hit me up on Facebook. You can always drive to Enid if you live close, or I can get you on phone or Zoom or whatever kind of platform we can do, Google Meet. So just contact me. So we're going to dive into Corette Scottish Chieftain tonight. And as I said, he was the 18th registered POA. It's a pretty cool story about Corette Scottish Chieftain. It starts out his backstory before we even talk about him. Bob Corette was an attorney. Him and his wife Lori lived on a beautiful ranch in Butte, Montana. And they were raising Shetland ponies in the early 50s. And they had some cattle too on their ranch. And they decided to get rid of their ponies. And they sold out of their Shetlands. You know, in the 50s, the Shetland market was kind of down. Well, in 1954, the new American spotted pony breed started, the Pony of the Americas, invented by Les Boomhauer. And there was a state legislature in Montana named E. Boo McGilva. I never met the man, but he was in the early 50s in POAs, and he had the 14th registered POA named Nana Sukin. Now, Nana Sukin didn't go on as famous as like Corette Scottish Chieftain or Siri Chief or Danny Boy, but he played a big part of POAs early on, and he was related to Kootenai's Wee Willie, and he was a very fast POA. And some of his offspring went on for games and stuff like that in racing when they did do racing in POAs. So, being a legislature in the state of Montana, he knew Bob Corette. They were friends, and he told Bob about the POAs and how, you know, he'd found this stallion, and Bob took a look at Nana Sukin, and he was so impressed by this little POA stallion in the mid-50s that he decided he wanted to find a stallion and maybe start raising ponies again. And that's just what he did. He found a stallion. He wrote a letter to Les Boomhauer in Mason City, Iowa, explaining that he was interested in getting POAs. Les knew who he was through Shetlands because Corette's had raised some great Shetlands registered ponies over the years. So as fate would have it, about the same time, there was a letter come to the office from a man in Ipswich, South Dakota. And the letter said that he'd received a boatload of cattle from Scotland, and they were Highland cattle, and that they came through Canada, and that when they arrived, there was a spotted pony stallion in the shipment of cattle. So the mystery is, did this little pony come from Scotland, or did he come from Canada? Where did he come from? He didn't come from the United States with the shipment, because when they met him at the border, he was already in the load. So we know he might have been in the United States earlier, but he did come across the border. So, but it was told that he did come from Scotland. So Bob Corette did purchase the stallion based off of a couple of pictures. I think one picture, and I'm having a little technical difficulty here, I'm sorry. let's see, we'll get it back. So I'll get back on myself here. But anyway, he ended up purchasing the stallion from the man in Ipswich, South Dakota for $600, and he registered him as Corette Scottish Cheifton. And the POA breed was just taking off. I mean, it was the early days. You had Siri Chief, and 3 of his own foals were in the first 17 registered. So there wasn't a lot of POAs registered at the time. And anyway, I lost my pictures here, so I may need a little help from my producer. I need a little help. I lost my pictures. I lost it right there. Okay. See, it went blue screen on me.
Okay,
I don't know why I did. It wouldn't click, and then that's the beauty of going live, folks.
Yeah. Get this out of here.
This is my producer, folks.
Hey, everybody. Hope you're enjoying the show tonight. We can get it figured out here for you here. Huh, that's weird. This.
See, that screen went blue, so all the photos left.
Well, oh, here's.
Are they right there?
Current application. Yeah, so it should be on there just fine. There. Oh.
There we go. Okay,
Which
just
one
click
are
on
we on?
that first one again, the one that's in blue.
There.
Yeah, there we go.
Brother,
And
I don't really know. But
let's
hopefully-
see. There they go.
Okay.
Okay. That's why Shane helps me
Well,
out. So,
If that happens again,
yeah.
just try to go up here and click out of that and back on
Click
it.
out of that.
Back
Okay.
on it, yeah. It's
All
just
right.
some little brain.
Okay.
And don't hit this button here.
Yeah, don't hit that button. Stay on that one. Those two, yeah. All right.
Okay?
Yep, hit
POA
that.
history.
POA history. Shane likes that POA history button. He created that.
Okay,
So
good.
thanks a lot, Shane. That was the general manager owner here at Jackson's Auto Family, Shane. So he built the studio, and I named it Studio J in honor of the Jackson's family. So let's get back to our story again. Sorry about that. This show will be a little shorter tonight. So, and again, I want to thank my main sponsor, Berry Sweet Acres from Dover, Minnesota, Tim and Melissa Andring. And we'll show you some pictures of their farm and some talk about some stuff they got up and coming. So here's Corette Scottish Cheifton after he got to Butte, Montana, and it was a cool story. You know, you had the first stallion had a black hand patterned on him, black hand, and then Siri Chief, the leopard Arabian story, and then all of a sudden for number 18, you had this pony that they named Scottish Cheifton because he came with a boatload of Highland cattle from Scotland, is what was rumored. So. Here he is as an older horse, Corette Scottish Cheifton. Corette's got back in got into POAs and back into the pony business hot and heavy. They advertised, they bought about 25 mares, and they did a good job promoting their colts. I wrote about it in Spots Included. He's chapter 3 in Spots Included, my book I published about 10 years ago, and how the first, like, number 145 through 147 was his stud colts, and they were already, like, in Florida and Indiana and Iowa. They'd spread across the country right away. So Bob Corette did very well getting Corette Scottish Chieftain's sons out there. Here is Bob Corette, the attorney from Butte, Montana. He's on the far left. He actually was the president of the POA club after the man in the middle, who we'll talk about him on some later episodes. That's Dr. Fowler Poling. He was a psychiatrist from Kansas. Unfortunately, he was killed in an automobile accident coming home from a POA sale from Iowa one year. And Bob Corette and Mr. Poling became close friends in a short period of time in POAs. And Mr. Corette took over as president and ran the POA club very successfully for a couple years. He was actually inducted, or a charter member of the Cowboy Hall of Fame and Museum in Oklahoma City due to his work with POAs. That's how big he was in POAs in the early 60s. And so was Mr. Poling. He did a great job in a short time. He had Apache Chief and Apache Brave, number 4 and number 13. Apache Brave became a grand champion, and the name of his farm was Powwow. And then with them there is the third officer. Just like today, there's 3 officers when you have the board of directors. So it was Mr. Boomhauer, Mr. Poling, and Mrs. Barrett, Neil Barrett, George Barrett's wife. She worked, I believe, for Les Boomhauer in his office, and then she was an officer of the club in the early days. So there is the Corette Ranch in Butte, Montana. You know, Montana's a beautiful place. I wish this picture was in color, but it was taken from like a 59, 60 yearbook out of the POA, early magazine, or one of their early yearbooks. And that's where Scottish Cheifton made his name, right there. And there he is with Bob and Lori as he got older. He was shown one time. I like this picture. He looks like an old broodmare now. Not much of a tail, but that's a pretty good hip for a pony born in the early 50s. And he also was known, his foals had pretty long necks. But he was only shown one time at a show. It might have been a fair or something, but it was a POA show in Montana, and he won his class. He's got a ribbon hanging off his halter there. But mainly he became, it was a sire. He was never broke to ride. The Corettes fell in love with him. They called him Scotty, was their barn name for him. The reason they ended up selling him is because Lori had a stroke, Bob's wife, and she's pictured in this picture. And they decided to once again get out of the pony business. I think they were getting up in age. She recovered from the stroke, but they sold their ponies and all their brood mares. Here's a cool picture here of the Corettes showing 3 of Scottish Chieftain's offspring. This would have been probably 59 or 60. That's Corette's War Whoop, Corette's Spotted Eagle, and Corette's Whitebird. Those are pretty little babies today, but remember the height limit was different, so even the baby limit was different back then, because when Scottish Cheifton was in it, or as an alive, it was 52 when he got into POAs. So another cool thing about Bob Corette is him and Boo McGilva also helped form the first state club. This is a trivia question, but it's a well-known question. The first state club ever formed in the United States for POAs wasn't in Iowa. That was the national club. It was Montana was the first state club. And this man here had a big part of forming that. So one of the first foals born in Montana by Corette Scottish Cheifton was this horse right here, which ended up being named Bear Paw. But this colt was born, I believe, in 58. For sure, he was born in 1958. And he was the first foal of a rather large crop that year. And they had a snowstorm. It was the spring, and he was born, and I forget the drifts of snow they've talked about and how cold it was. And the Corettes found him laying outside, and they said he must be pretty tough. So they said they named him after the toughest Indian they know, and that was Geronimo. So they named him Corette's Geronimo. And if you notice throughout these names, Corette used a lot of Indian names and names like that on his foals. Well, he sold at the sale. He was the high-selling colt that fall, and Les Boomhauer purchased him. Well, Les had Blackhand, still had him, so he got this colt and he renamed him Bear Paw because he had a mark on him that looked like a bear paw. So then the Boomhauers had Blackhand, and their junior stallion was Bear Paw. But Bear Paw would do a lot to help Corette Scottish Chieftain's name, and a lot of the bears that you see in pedigrees and stuff like that, and a lot of the paws came from him. He was the junior champion, as it says here, as a yearling at the international show. That was the first international show ever in 1958. The sales started in 57, and the first show was in 59, which is the Congress today, was the international show in 59. Here's Bear Paw as an older stallion. He was in Indiana for a long time, and he sired a lot of foals that people recognize when he was in Indiana. I mentioned it before. See, he was 147, so he was the first Corette one, and then they went after him, several Corettes that we'll be talking about. They had a lot of good foals. This is my favorite picture of Bear Paw. He looks pretty rounded there and everything. The halter's a little sliding off. It's a rope halter. It's not a show photo, but for a 1958 POA, you can see why he made a mark. And of course, he had beautiful coloring too. One of his famous foals was Bear Paw 2, and that came from the Boomhauers, I believe, and Barrett. And Bishop ended up buying him, George Bishop. As a historian, I really admire George Bishop because he helps me out a lot because he advertised so much and he put so much content in his ads. And look at these two pictures here. On our very first episode, I was telling Ashley about the picture of Bear Paw 2 carrying the elk. And that's the picture you see on the left. That's actually a staged photo in Utah, but that's a real elk on a little POA stallion. That's all real. But they didn't go hunting and kill the elk and all that. They had it staged for a photo shoot. And there he is with Jeff Mitchell. The Mitchell family showed with the Bishops. And there's Jeff jumping with Bear Paw 2. There's Bear Paw 2 pulling a cutter. That's a pretty good load for a little pony there. He was stout, Bear Paw 2 was. There's the full ad. So this is a cool ad. The reason I included this, I showed the top two already broken up, but the bottom is pretty cool because you see Bear Paw and how Corette Scottish Chieftain's his sire, and then you also see Hand Sha Sha and Black Hand. So just the early history in Bear Paw 2. Grandpa on the maternal side was number 1, and grandsire on the top side was number 18. And this is a closer look at that. And like I say, Bishop loved to explain things in his ads, and he always believed in breeding. He believed in early day POA breeding, and then he believed in thoroughbred and heavy quarter horse breeding later on when the height changed, and he helped POA that way. So here's that photo again. He used this a lot throughout the 60s and early 70s, just not to promote his place, St. Nicholas Pony Farm, but also to promote POAs in general, which he did very well doing that. And then there he is with, I believe, Sally Bishop's riding him there. That was a cover of a magazine. Beautiful scene in West Bonneville, Utah, or just outside of there in beautiful Utah. And that's after Bear Paw was getting a little older. Bear Paw 2, that is. So now we go back to Bear Paw, who's going to be the first one we're talking about of all the Corette Scottish Chieftain sons. And here's Bear Paw after he was in Indiana with his family. Most of these are his foals that we'll look at here in a minute. I think 1 or 2 might be Grandget. I believe this was taken at an international show in the 60s, I believe in 68, photo by Shirley Rice. And she's the person that took the famous photo of Chief Little Britches, the one where he's standing in front of that building. But there's Bear Paw, and the Werns family from Indiana promoted him and had a lot of good foals. They've kind of, history kind of forgot that name a little bit. Maybe some of that's my fault. I need to do a show on them and maybe try to find some relatives of them and interview them. But that's a pretty cool picture there. That's a lot of horses to condition. A lot of them are all junior ponies there, except for Bear Paw, who's standing over on the right. So here's Erie. She was in that photo. She's a young filly here. She was one of his famous national champion daughters. Here she is as she matured. That's the day she won in 68. Big old national trophy there. Here's Bear Claw. Cool name, clever name. And you'll see they use the bear name pretty clever on some of these. And Erie didn't get the pattern, but Bear Claw got the old pattern like Bear Paw 2 and the Black Hand and some of those. Here's Bear Hug, unique color. If you know what happened to some of these, you can always let me know. If you know somebody that rode them or had friends or family, or if you had some of these POAs. I can't keep track of all of them, of course. Snow Patch was a beautiful mare. She won her class at that international that year. Now here's a granddaughter of Bear Paw, and she won a couple years in a row. I think she was reserve grand champion, I believe twice. Imp's first lady, and she's a 2-year-old in this picture. Very nice POA she would have been a 66 model. Miami Mischief. I know a lot of people watching tonight will remember Miami Mischief. She was, or Mischief, but it's Mischief, and kind of a play on the words POAs used. She became a kind of a packer pony, won a lot of stuff with a lot of different families. There she is, younger. Pretty cool pattern, kind of that Bear Paw pattern, I call it. There's N.E. Wernz from Peru, Indiana, name up there. Give them a shout out. They bred some good early day POAs. So here's Corette's Indian Boy. This is going to be the next son of Corette Scottish Chieftain we talk about. Indian Boy started his own family of POAs with Gene Adams in Nebraska. Gene was the Star Acres POAs. I know a lot of people remember those. This picture's he's not quite standing stout like they do now, but he was a very good POA, kind of a bridge from the little bitty pony on up to him and Bear Paw both. More of the pony that was pretty popular in the 60s. And there's a good picture of him. This was actually on the cover in 1983 of the POA magazine. It did a story about him, how he was the high-selling yearling, and then they showed a picture of him retired as a 24-year-old gelding. And he was the 1962 International Grand Champion Stallion. So Apache Brave number 13 was the first one in 59, and then 60 and 61 was Walnut Prince from the Wilbur Ott program in Great Bend, Kansas. And then 62 kind of entered a new era, a little more modern POA, because Danny Boy had won in 63, Stewart's Danny Boy. And this guy kind of brought in the stock pony, as you can tell here. He was a little thicker in the neck, but he had a nice long neck. He had some muscles to him, forearms and gaskins, and that round hip. And there's an older picture of him after he was roning out. And you can see the front quarter view there, how he's a pretty stout POA. Your 1962 International Grand Champion Stallion. And there he is as an old man. He's 24 years old in that picture. And he ended up turning white. And but he kept his spots, and he's got a pattern. You could have called him some kind of hand name. You know, look at all those spots up on him. He looks like a painter's deal there with all the splotches. So this is one of his famous sons, Star Acres Firecracker. In this picture, he was owned by Goldenrod Pony Farm that I usually talk about every episode. And he did a good job for them, but then he was also sold to the Cannon family of Texas. And I know some of those family members watch this show, I hope. And TW's Twin Willow was their farm name. And Star Acres Firecracker sired some pretty good TWs. I don't have all the pictures tonight. I learned last week 165 pictures is a lot for a show, so I cut it down to 85 tonight. But TW's Firefly, the Scheidecker family from Wisconsin, she was one of their foundations. And then the second futurity winner ever of the Select Sire Futurity was her daughter, so a granddaughter of this horse, and that was Doc Smith's Firefly by East Acres Double Tough. And then TW's Firefly was a great, one of the great brood mares. She was a small mare, national champion small mare. She produced 5 international champions, I believe, like Gold Fire and Fireflies and Pressum. She had a couple futurity winners. She's the granddam of 2 very famous POAs. One, Fly the Gold, the DeBurr family made famous, and he was bred by the Rogers of Iowa. And then also Fly the Gold and Cowboy Brass, that the Kozers and Scheideckers together, the Kozer family had him. He was a son of Doc Smith's Firefly, and he won the futurity in 96 and went on to be a supreme champion and a great looking gelding. So that's Star Acres Firecracker. He's a grandson of Scottish Cheifton. Here's another Indian boy son, Star Acres Little Tornado. He didn't become as famous as Firecracker, but he did do some stuff. Here's Star Acres Fancy Boy. And Y owned by Gene Adams in Columbus, Ohio. Indian Boy, like I say, became a household name. He was inducted in the Hall of Fame in the 90s, I believe. And he had a lot of great mares. He was a sire of some very good fillies. Here's a relative of him on the bottom side. A shout out to Brenda Henderson. She sent me some pictures. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get them on tonight. Last night late, I dug for some pictures of her great horse, King Indian Boy, and I found some. I got lucky a little bit, but Brenda did send me some today, but I was just already had my set made, and I couldn't slip them in. But he was a great gelding and a speedster, too, as you see there turning that pole, and here he's turning a barrel. So, and I love his face mark. He had a very unusual face mark off to the side there, especially when you think like his great-grandsire, Corette Scottish Cheifton, had that old pony mark, I call it, on the nose, and so it's nice to see these strips and blazes on some of these going back to the older ponies. So here's an early ad for Corette Ranch and Little Basin Creek Road. That's pretty cool, near Girl Scout camp. But this would be a really early one. Jack Rivers was the manager for Bob and Lori Corette. There's Scottish Cheifton, the famous painting on the left. I've never seen that in color. I guess it's an oil painting. I don't think it's a pencil sketch. And then there's Corette's Hawkeye. We're going to talk about him. They kept him for a minute, but he ended up, right here it says he's leased to Ted Wagner of Kalispell, but he ended up to Bud and Bertie Campbell in Minnesota, the Campbells. Bud always called himself Campbell, but the Bud Campbell horses, Appy Acres in Rochester, Minnesota. Here's little Hawkeye in the front there, and Sundance, Corette's Sundance. We might see him later too, but Hawkeye made a pretty good name for himself. Bud was a very good promoter. There he is standing by his garage door. He was an interior decorator in Rochester, Minnesota. Like I said, he bred the Campbells. This was his first big stallion, was Corette's Hawkeye. He's actually double bred. Scottish Cheifton bred one of his daughters to produce this horse. And he did pretty well for the Campbells. There he is. They advertised him quite a bit. And here's one of his early sons. This would be Circle J's Hawkeye Joe. Circle J was Aaron Jewell. Aaron Jewell I owe a lot to, because he gave me his collection of magazines and sales catalogs. And not only that, he was a famous auctioneer in Iowa, and he did a lot of the national POA sales. So I have a lot of catalogs that has his notes. And then later I became an auctioneer in 13, and it was cool seeing the progression of the bids, you know, like 180, 200, 210, and then maybe an X. And so it was cool to see that, you know, from before I was even born. So this was a cool buckskin stallion here, Circle J's Hawkeye Joe, who was a grandson of Scottish Cheifton and by Corette's Hawkeye. Here's a Campbell, Corette's Hawkeye offspring. Campbell's Jack Spot, not Jackpot, but Bud named him Jack Spot. And he'd always laugh when people would get it wrong. He said he told me that story years and years later, that people would pronounce his name wrong, and he'd laugh because his name was Jack Spot. But he was a son of Hawkeye. Now this was one of the first Campbells that really kind of helped put Bud on the map, Bud and Birdie. This was, I believe, a 72 filly. This would have been taken at the Futurity, at the National Futurity when it started. And she won the Minnesota Futurity, it shows there. Bud won the Minnesota Futurity often, back in, starting with her in those days in the 70s and early 80s. But this was a cute little filly. Harper Krupp ended up making her a national champion, I think maybe twice. Or she might have won the first time when Bud still had her. But she was the first really, really good Campbell's offspring, was Campbell's Dewdrop. So here's an ad, Merry Christmas, and it's got the Corette Scottish Cheifton. They even started a foundation of people, and I'll show you a picture of that in a little while, of the breeders that bred with Corette Scottish Cheifton, kept his sons and daughters. And so this was a cool back ad of a December magazine from Corette, and then again his manager, Vi and Jack Rivers. So we're going to just go over some of the Corettes, and if you into history, you'll know some of these time is forgotten, but he had a few snow caps over the years, back before that was even a term. You know, some people knew it, but and long before a lot of people knew it was homozygous. So Corette's Broken Arrow was a classic snow cap, and here he's owned in Missouri, but he's produced quite a few POAs, and he was a little bigger POA, 53.5, because the height had changed, you know, in the 60s, so went to 54. Okay, so that takes us to our sponsor tonight. I want to thank again Berry Sweet Acres of Dover, Minnesota, my home state of Minnesota. It's Tim and Melissa Andring from Dover again, and I don't think I've ever met Melissa, but I've talked to her over Facebook and stuff for a long time. Her daughters, she raised her daughters in POAs, Liberty and Sophie. And actually I found out about 10, 11 years ago about this girl in Minnesota that was really interested in POAs and liked pedigrees, and her mom was talking to me through the internet, and I sent a big batch of magazines that I had extra. I handpicked some certain ones that I liked the covers and ones that were in good shape, and I just had doubles or triples of them, and I sent them up to Minnesota, and that was Liberty when she was a little girl, because I heard she was really into pedigrees and stuff. So I think she still shows horses. Her sister still shows POAs, and one of their first POAs happened to be, ironically, a Kiddo Tough daughter. Of course, being in Minnesota, Kiddo ended up in southeast Minnesota for a while. Dover's in the southeast corner of Minnesota by Iota, and this is She's No Kid. She was what I call a packer. You know what I mean? She might not be a national champion or this or that, but she taught these kids how to show POAs confidently, and look at her go there. So and she's pretty little there in that picture, that girl. So And then they moved on. They discovered the Dutch ponies and Dykstra when they were pushing pretty hard and raising a lot of great POAs, and they were raising a lot of numbers, and they fell for Major Equity, who a lot of people did. I love that stallion. He was a great POA stallion, produced by the Gardeners of Utah. And this is one of those products there that they showed. And they've had quite a few Dutch POAs, and some of their foundation for Berry Sweet Acres actually is from the Dutch. There's a Dutch POA right there. Always good POAs. There's Melissa now. She's riding as an adult rider, and that's one of her project POAs. I'm sorry, Melissa, I might not remember her name, but I believe it's, I think it might be a Silver Kid offspring. There's a cool picture of the two girls there when they're little on some POAs. One's a Minnesota bred, and one was on the far side was a hardship POA. Here's an early day picture with Dutch Rhythm and Blues. You probably remember that's a classic ad there, a really good ad. So, all right. Again, I want to thank Tim and Melissa from Berry Sweet Acres of Dover. And they got a cool project they just got. Big news if you follow Facebook and POA owners and stuff. They got a young prospect from the pony farm called Super Cool. That's his name. It's actually a play on pedigrees because our PR's Impulsive Superman is his sire. And then it goes back to Cool on the bottom side. So, well, I think sure enough, Cool Enough Skippa, a quarter horse, heavy Wieskamp bred. So Star Kid's in there. Star Kid bred that mare to get the mother, and then Superman's the sire. So he's a few spot, and he looks like a good prospect. So look him up. He'll probably be standing in Minnesota maybe in 2023. So again, check out for some prospects. They know how to train them up, and the kids get them quiet at Berry Sweet Acres in Dover, Minnesota. So we're going to continue here. Excuse me, I'm going to take a drink of water. But we're going to move to Corette's Nez Perce. Now, Jim Bicknell was one of the early presidents. I believe he was president of the board of directors probably like 65, 66, maybe one more year than that. But he had the Michi, or however you pronounce it, Michigan POA was his prefix. And Corette's Nez Perce, number 152, was one of his early ones. So he would have been in the same foal crop in 58 with Bear Paw. Here's Corette's Sundance. We seen him as a little baby with Hawkeye on the cover of the magazine. And here he is, kind of a keen-headed POA. Kind of see that 60s build. Corette's Comanche. I have a lot of pictures of Corette's Comanche. He was owned by some very good breeders a couple different times. He was a stallion most of his life. Lannon's had him for a while, and Lannon's usually bred a little more finer headed stuff than Comanche, but he had such a good body for the time, and they even put their quarter type pony, and that is quite a pony in a 51 3/4 package. And there again, he was born in 58, registered T149. So he also went to Ray and Barbara Klein, great breeders in Colorado, a lot of famous Kleins. Barbara's still around, very sweet lady. I like talking to her at conventions and sales and stuff. They had Corette's Comanche. He sired some champions for them as well. So he's an own son of Corette's Scottish Cheifton, one of his first sons. And then there's another picture. Lannon's had a backdrop photo shoot one time, and he was one of them that was in that photo shoot. He would have been a little younger there. And here he is when Lannon sold him. If you notice, it says Colorado in the notes there in the book, sold for $850. And that's when that was at a national sale. Here's Corette's Rabbit Tracks when he was in Rochester, Minnesota. He was one of the direct sons of Scottish Cheifton. He would have been a few years later. If you notice his number, he's already almost 3,000. Hans Paw. This is he's both Black Hand and Corette Scottish Cheifton, and he's kind of looking that early, a little stubbier looking, kind of getting a keen head on him, but a little stout in the shoulder and the neck there. But Hans Pa did sire some foals that did some stuff in POAs. Here's another snowcap, direct son of Scottish Cheifton. This would be Corette's little engine, and I got quite a few pictures of him. That's not one of them there, but this is Nez Pierce. We looked at him earlier, Corette's Nez Pierce. This is one of his most famous sons, and this is Happy Talks, Mr. President. And there was a couple famous Happy Talks, quite a few. Happy Talks Mr. Wonderful was a stallion, and Happy Talks Mr. President. But this would have been a grandson of Corette Scottish Cheifton, and I believe he was born in 1964. The Jansen family, I think they're from Missouri. I shouldn't say that, I might be wrong, but they're from the Mid-America area, and they had the Happy Talks. Here's Corette's Sundance again. We've seen him a few times now. Kind of a young stud in that picture. Now, this is a poor picture, but I included this in here because this is after Scottish Cheifton left Montana. So the Sales family of Washington bought Blackhand. And it was kind of a big splash. They bought him at the sale when basically Boomhauer and Barrett got rid of most of their POAs, and they put Blackhand, I think lot number 9. He brought $7,750 back in 1963, which was something else for a pony. And on the way, they stopped at in Butte, Montana, at the Corette Ranch, and they seen Corette Scottish Cheifton. Well, a little while later, they bought him and I think 10 of his daughters. The Sales did, and this would be one of those offspring that came out of Washington. There's Little Engine again. Here's another bear paw, hands, ink spots. Kind of got that same blanket pattern, a little more blanket. Now this picture is kind of not a high resolution picture. There's an X because he probably wasn't at the sale. Some reason the auctioneer or whoever had the catalog put an X through it. But this is hitting a lot of history spots in our next chapter in the Corette Scottish Cheifton. So that's why I put Lannon's Cheifton in this section tonight. And N.R. Stevenson consigned him to the sale. A lot of us know Norm. I had the privilege of meeting him in his later years. He was an early director. Back in the day, him and Bob Moser and Lynn Puffenbarger and a lot of those guys were early directors. They were in their young 30s and mid 30s, and when they were in POAs in the 60s. And a lot of the rules and standards we have today is because of guys like this man right here, Norm Stevenson. We'll be talking about him a lot coming up, maybe even next week. But whenever I slay the dragon and talk about dragon, Norm Stevenson will be a big chapter in that. But here he's got a grandson of Corette Scottish Cheifton, and that leads us to Little John S. Now, Little John S. was a South Dakota stallion, and he was owned by the Sharping brothers. Another name that might have slipped out of the history books a little bit, but it's too bad that it did. But they didn't come around POA events that much. They had a lot of sales at their place in South Dakota, and they had exotic animals, and a lot of POA people that were into exotic animals like Bud Campbell, Carl Louse, and then later like Ray Peets and Max Nebergall. They found their way out to South Dakota, and a lot of great POAs came from the Sharping brothers. Black Swan S was bred by the Sharping brothers, one of the greatest mares of all time. Cricket McHugh was an Appaloosa bred by them, and she was hard-shipped, and Carl picked her up, Carl Louse. She ended up being a grand champion. The Latch family had her, and they had Cricket McHugh and Futurity Winner and a lot of good foals by her. But anyway, Little John S. was one of their early stallions. He was a 1962 Scottish Chieftain son. And Little John S. sired some pretty good POAs. They might not be in order here, but he sired full brothers that Carl Louse got a hold of, Johnny Charm and Jimmy Charm. Johnny Charm was the 1972 Grand Champion Gelding. He was a beautiful looking POA, very chromed up, and just a modern POA for 72. And then Little John S. also sired some others that we'll be talking about. But here's a Corette Scottish Chieftain on the bottom side, GR's Serie Feather. You have Serie Chief and Scottish Chieftains, the grandparents. So here's the association I was talking about. Scottish Chieftain Breeders Association. Barbara Klein was the secretary at this time. You have Highview Farm, which was in Illinois. That's Stuart Yoakum. Larry Yoakum's his son. He's still involved in POAs. Larry's owned a lot of great POAs and shown POAs, but the double Highview and some of those POAs came from his dad's farm. He was an early POA breeder in Illinois, a good POA breeder. So he was connected to the Scottish Chieftain Association. We already talked about Appy Acres, Bud and Bertie Campbell of Rochester. The Misha POA Farms, I talked about him. Mr. and Mrs. James McNeil III, he was a president of the board early on. Ray and Barbara Klein, a lot of famous Klein's POAs. And then you have Happy Talk Pony Farm. I talked about them. There it is. I was right. Once in a while I'm right. But in Missouri, and the Jansons, Dr. and Mrs. J.E. Jansen. And then the Sales, who bought Corette Scottish Chieftain. So they were in Washington. This would have been after the Corettes got out of POAs. So, but they promoted Scottish Chieftain, passed away in 1971. And people, promoted him all the way up to then, and then even past then with his sons. Here's another son, Corette's Tomahawk. He had a lot of colts. He sired, I believe, 92 registered POAs, which doesn't seem a lot compared to other horse breeds, but in POAs, 92 is a pretty good number of registered foals. I'm sure he had a lot that were never registered as well. There's Hawkeye as a baby. He's took somebody's hat, and a white cowboy hat there. That was the photo shoot for the cover that they had that year. So as I said, there he is. Famous sire passes away. Corette Scottish Chieftain died, I believe it was in 71. Yep, March 21st, 71, it says right there. And another story that helped make him famous and kept his name going, the Scottish story helped a lot, and then just having good foals, helped him immensely. And the Corettes promoting him and stuff. But when Bob Corette sold him to the Sales family in Washington, one of the things that he said was that he wanted his hide tanned. When he passed away, he wanted Corette Scottish Chieftain's hide to be kept and tanned, which it was. The Sales honored that wish, and it hung in the national office in Iowa for years and years. I'm not sure if it made it to Indiana. I believe they auctioned it off or did something at a sale one year, and I don't remember where. I think maybe Betty McLaren ended up with it. I have no idea where it is now. If somebody knows, please let me know. But I don't think it's in possession of the National POA Club. But that just added to the story, his hide hanging in the national office. So we're going to get into some modern day POAs, which I call modern. I guess we're already 30 years old or more. But some stuff that traces back to Scottish Chieftain. This picture, a lot of people might not recognize this mare, but she's on the short list of great brood mares. This is Miss Heideck. She was born in Texas, made her life famous in Minnesota, lived most of her life in Minnesota. The Lewis family bought her. She believed she was a yearling or a 2-year-old. They made her supreme champion. The Lewises in the 70s, they had 3 kids that showed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they showed mares a lot. And they made a lot of mares famous. Tough Sample, who became the mother to Tough Plotted, Cayuga's Frosty Patches, Crazy Cherokee's Crazy Alice, or whatever her name is. They had her, and Miss Heideck, of course, was their mare that really did well for them as a brood mare. Her first foal by Gold Prince was named Bug Me. Her second foal, everybody knows him. He's a little miniature edition of Gold Prince, and that's Gold Chips, the immortal Gold Chips, born in 1982 in Anoka, Minnesota. So this very modern POA traces back to Corette Scottish Chieftain, because Miss Heideck she's by a quarter horse named Dex High Card. That's where the high comes in, H-I. But her mother was JB's Montana Maid, and she was a daughter of Montana's Chieftain. Montana's Chieftain stood at Rutledge's for a long time in Texas, and some of the Rutledge's famous POAs are related to him as well. So here's Gold Chips. Her next foal was Miss Gold Dust. Now Gold Chips was second as a baby to Burnt Sugar at the International, and he won the Select Sire Futurity. the very first select sire futurity. The next year, his full sister, a Palomino with the blanket, took first at she won the international as a weanling in '83, and then she was second in the select sire futurity to a double tough daughter that I mentioned earlier that's related to Corette Scottish Chieftain, and that's Doc's Miss Firefly. So a lot of people might not realize that, but the second futurity ever, select sire futurity, first and second place fillies in '83 were related to Corette Scottish Chieftain. And then Miss Heideck's third foal became just as famous. This is Double Deck. She's by Doc's Built Tough. She won the international as a baby, yearling, 2-year-old, and a 3-year-old. And then she also did well in Pleasure. The Neblocks family ended up with her, and then she ended up with the Spencers in Oklahoma. But there she is with Leonard as a baby. She took third in the futurity, so those three babies were first, then the next filly was second, this one was third. But like I say, she won the international. She's still the only POA to win her class as a weanling, yearling, 2-year-old, and 3-year-old. And I don't know if that'll ever be done again. So here's an older POA that's just thrown in here, Hans Cheifton. This would have been, I wanted to represent Washington a little bit here and show some of the Black Hand and the Scottish Chieftain mixes that happened when Sales had him in Washington. Here's another relative of Corette Scottish Chieftain through Nez Perce Squaw. This would be Nez Perce Challenger. Here's Bear Claw. Again, I had a picture, but this is on the cover in 1969. This would be a Bear Paw offspring. Scottish Hands Wakanda. This is long before Marvels, probably, but Black Hand bred an own daughter of Scottish Chieftain to get this colt. And there you see GD Sales from Washington. Here's Johnny Charm that we mentioned earlier. I wish I had a picture of him without the blanket. I stayed up late last night trying to find one, and I couldn't. I know there's some out there, but he was a well-built, beautiful POA. Came from the Sharpings, sired by a little John S., who was a Corette Scottish Chieftain's son. And he won it all in 1972. Here's another Jean Adams. You know, I talked about Star Acres Firecracker. She also had Star Acres Top Brass that became a famous son. Corette Scottish Chieftain nowadays we'd call, or Corette's Indian Boy, I'm sorry, the sire to this one, Indian Boy. We'd call him a broodmare sire now. His foals, he had more fillies than colts. He only had a few colts that really sired a lot, but this was one of them. And otherwise, he had some champion daughters and some mares that produced, and you can trace their pedigrees back still today. But this guy is the sire of Brass Blitz and Brass Buckles, both speedsters, and I think they might both be supreme champions, but pretty famous POAs in the 70s, show POAs, and they were sons of this guy. So this picture here, I've shared this on Facebook before. This is Sales. I think this is Cahokia Leopard Doll or something like that. She's not related to Corette Scottish Chieftain, but why I put this in here is because she was one of 3 mares bred to him when he passed away. And I'm not sure what happened. I maybe did 20 years ago. I'm not as sharp in history as I was when I was in my teens or even my 20s or 30s. But she was a beautiful mare, and she was bred to Scottish Chieftain. And I know she foaled, but I don't know what she foaled. But I just thought she's a cool looking filly. And there she is with, I believe, Mr. Sales winning a show in Washington. So I was just going to end it with that right there, because she was, if anybody knows, maybe Tracy or somebody, she has some Washington connections and she's a POA historian. If this mare did foal by Scottish Chieftain, it would have been one of 3 of his last foals ever, which would have probably been born in '72. So I told you it was going to be a lot faster show tonight. So I got in most everything I wanted, I think. I got a whole notebook here of stuff, which I hardly looked at. That one baby with the sponsor I didn't mention, he was sired by 50 Shades Darker, and his name was Berry Sweet Rhythm, I believe. He's a colt in that picture. And again, I want to thank Berry Sweet Acres. Watch for their prospects. They have a few foals this year, and they may have probably 4 foals next year, hopefully. And they know how to get POAs promoted for you and get them out there. We need people like that, little farms that are starting POAs and working with their babies, and to go to the next level. So then they want to become supreme champions or whatever, and you want your kids to take them on. So I also want to thank Jackson's Auto family, Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, Ram. This has been my home away from home for the past 8 years. And I want to thank Shane Jackson. You got to see him tonight. He's my tech guru. So again, if somebody wants to be on the show, don't be nervous. You can call in, or I can call you right on the show. There's no real script. I just follow loosely. It's a live podcast. It's going to be on. Don't get nervous, but it will be on forever on Facebook. And I have most of them on YouTube. The last one's not on YouTube yet, but I'll work to get these 2 on there. We do have like 3,000 viewers or views from the first one. The next 3 now have had, the next 2 had quite a few, over 1,000 views, and I'm hoping to get those views up. But next week I'll probably be talking about Dragon. I might slip something in beforehand, but I have so many families and POAs and kids to talk about. I won't run out of topics. So thank you everybody for watching. If you want to be a sponsor, contact me privately. It's very inexpensive, and I'm going to be at the show in Tulsa handing out some swag with Black Hand and Beyond on it, so to help promote this podcast. So I hope everybody enjoyed this history tonight about Corette Scottish Chieftain number 18. Have a good night, everyone.